Welcome back to another Box Score Geek show. The playoff race is on. March Madness is happening. So, of course, we're going to talk about Dre's love of reality TV. I'm your host, Dre Alvarez, a.k.a. Nerd Numbers. And with me, as always, is my producer, voice of God, man of many hats, Brian Foster. Say hey, Brian.
Yeah, what's going on, Dre? I watched, a little bit of Zion Williamson and whatnot, but forget that. We are NBA.
NBA and Mental Samurai, which
Yeah.
we will do. All right, so... quick reminder of how the show goes down. We're going to do sponsorship first because we're legit now. Last week on Lost, that's your comments on pieces we've had in the last week around the NBA. A bunch of subjects Brian and I have just cobbled together that we want to talk about, and then our big subjects. And this week we will be talking about how Izzo is a horrible coach and Mental Samurai, a reality TV show that does tentatively tie into basketball stats analytics. All right, Brian. So as I mentioned, we do actually have a sponsor for the show. Sunshower.io. Apologies to the listeners. I'm going to do the same copy as last week. You'll know when this is like really official when Brian and I do the podcasting and like record a fake ad where we say we'll take a break and then Brian and I come back on and we're talking. But heard it before, like that's when you'll know we're big time. When I call you out on a weekend, Brian, to record a copy, then you'll know it's for real. But for now, we'll just have me reread the copy I've already written. All right. Do you have a cloud-based solution, or are you interested in one? Of course, many cloud platforms like AWS, Heroku, DigitalOcean, etc. mean you have limitless options for getting your solution to the cloud. But are you sure it's configured properly? Are you sure you're spending the right amount of money? Do you have multiple solutions that you want to easily monitor from one website? If so, then Sunshower.io is just what you're looking for. They'll help you customize a cloud solution from scratch, if that's what you're looking for, or they'll help you optimize your current cloud solutions to ensure that you're getting the most efficient and cost-effective solutions you can. I tried to do things on the fly, Brian. Don't know what I'm doing here. Anyway, check them out at sunshower.io, and you can do the customer code nerd numbers. So that's sunshower.io/nerd numbers, and tell them I sent you. Well, the URL tells them I sent you. I'm doing the same joke as last week, Brian. See, we're already getting into the rhythm of this. All right. Well, anyway, let's get back to last week on Lost. We had a few comments. So let's talk. I'm going to kind of tie in a subject we have from around the NBA with a comment because they tie together nicely, Brian. So on last week, Giannis had gotten a 50-point. I don't know if it was either. I think it was a double-double, close to a triple-double, but a 50-point, amazing game, close loss to the 76ers, and we kind of said, this nationally televised amazing game out of Giannis is just what he needs. I have a box scores of the week segment where I use MVP voting. That's 5 points for the best box score of the week, 4 for second, 3 for third, etc. And I've been tracking this through the NBA throughout the season. So there have been like 23 weeks now. And Giannis had a clear lead after last week. He'd been on the list 8 times, and he was in the lead with 31 points. Second place was James Harden, also on the list 8 times, but he was like 9 points back. As you can see, 5 points for first means it's going to take, he's going to need like 2 firsts to catch up. And Giannis is going to have to like be absent from the list. So we were kind of saying, wow, this list is really winding down for Giannis being, I guess, our top box score MVP of the year, whatever that means. And then you were noting the same thing. This game was huge and is probably cementing his real MVP odds. So we said that. This last week, James Harden tied himself. So he's done this 2 times this year, Brian. He scored 61 points in a game to beat the Spurs. Highest scoring game of the NBA season this year. Bunch of just bizarre, absurd stats, Wilt Chamberlain-like. And then also when you factor in the fact that James Harden assists as well as he does. He averages 7.5. He's basically averaging like 35 points a game, 7.5 assists a game. Per possession, it's like the highest scoring NBA season ever. This is just a ridiculous performance out of James Harden. And so same thing on the box scores of the week. He only placed second because Bojan knocked down my Nuggets. That was really sad. The Nuggets were briefly, we're going to talk about this more for sure, Brian, briefly in possession of the first seed in the Western Conference, and then they just got destroyed by the Indiana Pacers. But James Harden came in second. Giannis didn't show up on the list, and now James Harden is nipping at Giannis's heels on our top box scores of the week MVP criteria award. And then also, as you've noted, other analysts like Arturo Galletti, American Numbers on Twitter, if you don't follow him, are noting in the real MVP race. So we don't really know where this is going to end up. Math says noted that he's pretty sure James Harden follows our blog, saw that he was in second place and was like, this is unacceptable. I am going to put up some amazing box scores, get myself to the top of that list, win that award. And so all I say is like, I agree. And so if James Harden wins the MVP, he has to credit us. Like in his acceptance speech, he's going to have to say, hey, I was really, really motivated by the Boxscore Geeks blog.
He can credit you. I've been on this Giannis train, so I will take no credit for James Harden, although I love him.
Well, my key point that I've brought up so many times, and I even tweeted out about this week, is first, I think the NBA could really just do a lot aping Major League Baseball and just do an MVP for each conference. And even if we, for instance, I'm in the same boat as you. I do think that Giannis is a better player than James Harden. And for the boxes I would tick as a voter for MVP, ticks more of those boxes, right? Just better overall production, more versatile player, harder position, better team, et cetera, et cetera. That being said, James Harden is easily in my MVP voting list, and it's very Oscar-ish, where there are some years where multiple really good movies come out, and they all arguably could deserve.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Oscar Robertson. So you're talking about the Academy Awards.
Well, same point, actually. Oscar Robertson, he had a triple-double season. Same year, Wilt Chamberlain averaged 50 points a game. Neither of them won MVP because Bill Russell put up a really good season and the voters actually looked at defense, unlike modern voters. But that's all I'm saying is James Harden is putting up an MVP-worthy season. So I have absolutely no complaints if he wins it or doesn't. Yeah. That's always been my criteria. Like when Derrick Rose won the MVP, I think Derrick Rose, Allen Iverson, and Michael Jordan's MVPs are the only major ones that I think I have real problems with in the modern box score.
What about Steve Nash, who is really, really good, but he took it over Shaq one year, didn't he? During one of Shaq's.
If you want to look that up while I'm talking.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't remember.
I think he was top. I mean, like, if you're a top 5 wins producing player, I'm not going to be I'm not going to be mad if you win MVP. Yeah. It's kind of as simple as that. And then I think Shaq has kind of always had the injury issues. So you end up in this weird category where you could say Shaq was probably more productive, but I think Steve Nash played more games. It is what it is. But I'm saying I have no complaints if an MVP worthy player wins the MVP, even over other deserving people. That's my only time I get pissed is when someone who doesn't deserve the award wins the award, not when a deserving person wins the award over someone else. But like I said, copying MLB, if you just cut it in half and give each conference an MVP award and a Rookie of the Year award, Sixth Man of the Year award, et cetera, then life gets a lot more easier and a lot more fair. And my whole point on this is when the NBA started, it had 8 teams and had 1 MVP. And it's expanded. It's at 30 teams. We still only have 1 MVP. I don't, and it's interesting because we're going to be talking coaching later on the show, Brian, and the stupid mentality of older generations that, used to have like lead paint in their houses. So, whatever they used to smoke asbestos. So I'm not sure I want to give this generation much credit on how to properly raise and mold our youth. But this older generation of hating the idea of participation trophies and nurturing, I don't actually see a problem with saying we have the top athletes in the world playing this game, basketball. We can recognize more of them. And it's not like some mean thing to do to say, hey, the top 1% of people in the world that can do this activity, maybe we should give more than 15 of them an all-NBA thing. Maybe we should give more than one of them an MVP thing. So that would be my criteria. James Harden and Giannis easily win the 2 MVPs. Paul George has kind of faded down the stretch. I'd be more than fine with that. I will be more than interested to see what happens because we're just going to have to see who wins the MVP. Arturo, like you said, is already starting to say James Harden is in his opinion, switching mainstream perception. We notice that it's a hard thing to do because even as recently as a couple of years ago, they changed up the MVP voting criteria where votes are transparent now. That didn't used to be the case. So when you're trying to project how MVP voters are going to vote, it's hard to even use even 10 years ago because things are different. We were talking about this pre-show, the same problem with polling. The polling projection model worked really, really well for a couple of elections, and a few things changed up, and it didn't work as well because there are so few presidential elections to use as your model. And it's the same thing with MVPs. You have to accept that we have
to be fair, though, the Electoral College did kind of screw up the 2016 election, if that's what you're talking about. And what I mean by that is Nate Silver and the others were basically saying, yeah, we think Hillary Clinton's going to win by 3 million votes in the end, which she did, but Electoral College. But I do take your point on that.
I got a great follow on Twitter if you don't. Kelly Scaletta. I think I hope I'm saying that right. Big Houston Rockets fan, great writer, has his own site now or writes for a new site. And he's also an amazing historian, amazing historical buff. Him and Dave Barry are both good on this. And he'll talk politics in the Electoral College, and it is amazing. We'll get on our slight political soapbox for a few seconds, Brian. I'm actually sure we'll end up back on it this show since we're going to be talking NCAA. But he notes how messed up our voting system in the United States is, and if you really, really go back in time, it was
3/5 compromise.
So I might actually even let you speak more because I don't know it, as well at all. But he's just noting like things like the Electoral College and all this stuff and like the gerrymandering issues. So much of this has to do that when our country was young, we built around slavery. We were like, how can we handle that some states want slavery and some states don't? How do we build a voting system that supports both of those? And that's what we got. And so it's amusing that we're in the modern day where hopefully if they're not outright white nationalist, if you talk to most people, they'll say, yeah, slavery is wrong. And you say, okay, so we should get rid of this system that only existed because we really wanted to support slavery. And they're like, no, but it's always been that way. So that does get a little amusing how things have changed. So even what you're saying, like trying to model a thing where you're like trying to model a system that was built for a different world that's now used for the modern world where we have the right data of how people think, but we don't necessarily know what's going to happen. Ironically, that does in my mind to completely trivialize it, relate to like trying to predict how voters are going to vote.
It's
for trivial things like MVP and Rookie of the Year things in the NBA.
Yeah, I guess I won't touch that, and I'll go back to NBA just because, God, it's such a big can of worms. I'd love to go into it, though, Dre, but we don't want to go late. So here's why MVP is so dumb to me. It's like the criteria seem very shaky, and everyone's kind of voting for different things. So the reason why I think Giannis is the clear MVP is because you have this pile of players at the top, like you were saying, right? Harden, Giannis, Rudy Gobert is up there. Actually, a lot of people on Reddit and other social medias today were social medias. That's how you say it, not websites. It's the social medias.
Social media.
It's a series of tubes. So everyone's all up on Gobert's numbers today that he's like career high and everything, and he's like 66 or 67% true shooting. So Gobert is getting some love finally.
I'm giving you a clap because, he is playing absolutely absurd. As we've noted, and I still haven't gotten around to it, if we adjust the position adjustment on the site to split power forwards and centers into their own category, Gobert probably gets a little worse.
Yeah. But just to finish up my point before we go to Gobert real fast, any of those guys, all those guys are really good and deserve it, right? I think the Bucks are clearly the best team. And when you're talking about MVP, it's not the best player, right? It's some people say it's the best player on the best team, and others don't, and that's why I think it's so dumb. But anyway, let's.
Well, it is frustrating where there is not an explicit criteria, and so there are these implicit criteria, and then those shift. Because, for instance, the last point I'll have on James Harden is if there's a player that deserves to win an MVP, even though there was a clear front runner that we thought had it locked up, and actually this is something we might want to do on this, Brian. We might want to talk to Andrew Sutton because a few years ago, James Harden, clear front runner for the MVP. I was on this show, James Harden MVP, James Harden MVP. Andrew Sutton in some emails or even on the show was just like, no, Russell Westbrook's going to take it. And I was like, what? And he's like, yeah, he's going to average a triple-double for the season. They're going to give him the MVP for it. When I had looked historically, same idea of like trying to model polling, I kind of had noted that really you didn't win MVP if you weren't a top 3 seed. In the modern voting scheme, which is you have beat writers, et cetera, vote on it, if you weren't a top 3 seed in your respective conference, you just did not win the MVP. That had not happened. And then usually there was some criteria for scoring, et cetera. But Russell Westbrook won it for this historic season, but it kind of came out of nowhere. And it's kind of the same thing here. Giannis's production was like he just has to play okay for the remainder of the season, and the award is his, was kind of our thinking. And I think not a bad thought. James Harden is coming out of here and just there have been 18 50-point games this season, unless any happen while or after we record, Brian. There have been 18 50-point games this season. James Harden has 8 of those. He has got the 2 highest scoring games this NBA season at 61, both over 60, obviously, and is averaging the highest points per possession in NBA history. That is a historic season that's kind of coming out of nowhere. if there's a player that goes, hey, you owe me an MVP that was snatched from me because of historically.
Oh, I like that angle.
It's James Harden. So if he snatches from Giannis for doing that, that's fine. And I'll get to the last. We were talking like the 3 MVPs that I thought were wrong. As a reminder, someone correct me if there's another name, but I think these all qualify. I think these are the only 3. I believe it's 2011. Derrick Rose won the MVP. It was the voters basically sticking it to LeBron James for jumping ship to Miami because LeBron James was just much more productive, but Chicago had a better win-loss record. Derrick Rose is the highest scoring points per game player on that team. They gave the award to Derrick Rose. Really, really should have gone to LeBron, and there were a multitude of other players like Dwight Howard had an amazing season too. So Derrick Rose had no business getting that award. Allen Iverson in 2001, again, no business getting the award. You said Shaq. Shaq was significantly better. My boy Dikembe Mutombo, I think, according to a lot of even trivial, stupid mainstream metrics, was the best player in the NBA. Allen Iverson won it for whatever reason. Yay points. People didn't want to give it to Shaq. So, that one, he was just so far off. And then in 1998, Michael Jordan won it. Now, the last thing I'll give you is in Michael Jordan's case, you could argue that was either a lifetime achievement award or a makeup one, because I think I think Michael Jordan had 1 or 2 other seasons where he probably deserved an MVP and didn't get it. I think 1989 we think is his best NBA season. He didn't get an MVP because his team just was like a 47-win team, this weird implicit criteria we talked about. So I have no problem if Giannis doesn't win the award this year and just gets like a makeup award when he's like the 5th or 6th best player in a couple of years.
Yeah, and that's a fair point. And if they do win the title, I'm sure he's not going to give a damn about the MVP. And right now, that looks like the safest odds.
All right. So let's see. Let's go to great comment from Iceman. Iceman was noting that he'd love to see like the Arturo playoff rotation Bucks, but we're in an interesting position, Brian. I think we cursed them last week.
Oh, they're getting injuries again, huh?
Because Iceman brought up Brogdon, but Brogdon's out injured. Last week, we basically said Brook Lopez is kind of a meh player for the playoffs, and you said Mirotic, good thing they picked up Mirotic. And, of course, what happens, Brook Lopez goes off, has an absurd game right after bash him, and then Mirotic gets injured, and it's a thumb injury, so that ain't good. So
is it on his shooting hand?
I do not know, actually. I haven't looked that up.
Either way, though, you got to be able to hold the ball.
But it's kind of funny where one thing we did notice about the Bucks versus the other contenders. So the other contenders I would give you would basically be Toronto, Philadelphia, Golden State, Denver Nuggets, and scarily enough now actually Houston. These teams have been really beat up this season. The Rockets have been missing Capella and Chris Paul for a lot of the season, didn't get Fareed till late into the season. Nuggets were missing Millsap, Gary Harris, Will Barton early in the season. They're all back. And then, of course, they were doing stupid stuff like playing Isaiah Thomas, which is gone now. Then, also the Warriors, lots of interesting stuff going on there. We'll talk about in a bit, but, Durant, Curry, DeMarcus Cousins have all missed time. Draymond Green, too, I think. So these other teams have been banged up going through the season and possibly are starting to get healthy come playoff time, which is huge. Whereas the Bucks were just healthy and a beast and kept improving on themselves, trading away players and getting small improvements over the year, which was great. And then now come playoff time, Brogdon's injured, Mirotic is getting injured. So we're in this funny phase where it's possible the Bucks get unhealthy at the wrong time and the rest of the NBA gets healthy at the right time. I still think they're fine for the first round or two of the playoffs, especially out east, especially with how like Boston's kind of imploding on itself. So we'll definitely have to see. But I did find that amusing, Brian. I kind of joked it was like a Madden curse of ours, for those that don't know. This is an availability heuristic thing too, by the way.
Yes.
So Madden is a popular set of video games. They'll usually pick a great player to grace the cover of their various games, basketball, football, hockey. And then they've had lots of cases where the player that graces the cover has a horrible next season or gets into horrific injury or something like that. But I think that's just when you produce a game every year and you have multiple sports and there's a lot of reversion to the mean, et cetera, you're just going to have some of those happen. So that's kind of the case. But we definitely had a Madden curse like there where we came out swinging, talking about the Bucks, and then immediately after I was like, oh, and by the way, that last week too, we came out swinging and said, Giannis has this MVP thing wrapped up, and unless Harden does something amazing, he's not going to catch him. And he goes out and does a 61-point game against the Spurs.
Yeah, and it can still go either way. But I like your point about the Bucks getting hurt at the wrong time. You could be right. Like I'm kind of assuming all health is going to be equal in the playoffs, and of course it won't be. Maybe those guys on the Bucks will be able to play, and play effectively, or maybe they won't. We'll have to see. And I do want to make another thing on the East though is I keep reading the same thing on the Celtics, and they have been a little bit worse lately. But their fundamental numbers, their Pythagorean, is a lot better than their record. It is still, Dre, despite these recent problems and the Rockets rising up, they're still ahead of the Rockets in SRS for this season. They're 7th, Boston is, which is good enough for 3rd overall in the East still. Well ahead of the 76ers, who are down at 11th, by the way. And the Celtics are also a team that aren't that deep necessarily. Like, they have a few good stars. So I can still see them doing some damage in the playoffs. Maybe, going after the Bucks in the second round or something like that if the Bucks are still hurt. So, yeah, and I'm just because the 76ers are a little bit lower, it doesn't mean I'm disrespecting them. They could do really well, too. And Toronto, like Siakam, everyone's liked him, right? He's really lived up to the hype this season. Of course, Kawhi, we know about that. And even Marc Gasol has kind of been okay, even though we don't like that trade. So, yeah, the East looks really strong at the top, I think. Even Boston, who, this, again, to me seems like a media narrative, right? Like, I just keep reading, oh, it's so toxic. Everyone keeps saying Brad Stevens is overrated. No one respects him. Again, getting into this coaching thing. Maybe he needs to yell at his players more like Tom Izzo, Dre, and they would respect Brad Stevens. But I keep reading all this stuff. Maybe it is a toxic locker room, but Boston still has good fundamental numbers.
Yeah, and I'm trying to look. So let's see. Last season, of course, their top thing was that they were amazing at defense and actually god awful at offense. Their expected win-loss last season. So like this is funny. I love your narrative point. Last season, their expected Pythagorean wins. So this is Basketball Reference translating their point margin into expected wins, which I was talking to Dave Barry about this, where basketball, this is an amazing metric. In basketball, point margin lines up with win percentage amazingly well, explains like 95% of the variation in win-loss record.
It's like the foundation of all analytics for the most part in the NBA.
And it's actually the reason basketball analytics are the best is because of that underlying. Exactly. So I'll give you like three funny games. Are you like a racing game fan?
Like racing video games?
Yeah, so like a friend, I think Forza was the really like realistic one back in the day.
Yeah.
So a friend of mine loved Forza. So Forza is like perfect engine. You can drive real cars, amazingly good racing video game. Then there's Mario Kart. Now Mario Kart is still a pseudo. We've been bashing meritocracy around here a lot, but Mario Kart is a game of skill, but there's also some weird random elements built in. So the game, for instance, will let computers cheat when you're ahead. Give them slight speed boost if you're playing with your friends. It changes the random number generator because in the game you get power up items, and the further behind you are, the better items you're likely to get. So people hate this thing called a blue shell. If you're really, really far ahead and first, it'll give this ultra powerful beefed up item that will let you kind of catch up. So it's still a game where skill matters, but there's still some weird randomness involved. And then there's Mario Party, which is a party game. It's a really fun one, but it's just freaking random and it's bizarre. And it's a fun game to play because it's essentially a board game on a computer, but skill doesn't really line up. The reason basketball stats, when we talk about like the advanced stance movement and why we're so behind basketball, is the underlying rules of basketball really, really map well to win-loss. And for a variety of reasons, we've got an 82-game season as an example. That's really huge. Each game has a ton of possessions, so that point margin lines up really well to win-loss. Whereas, like baseball, where everybody thinks the advanced stats are better, and the birth of Moneyball, baseball basically has a quarter of the possessions of a basketball game, and you can have much huger swings. You cannot have any play in the fourth quarter. I mean, like Tracy McGrady pulled the epitome of like what you can stretch, right? But like you can't score 20 points in a minute in basketball. But that's like you're breaking the bounds of what is possible. Baseball, you can be down 20-1 in the ninth inning and come back and win. So there's a fundamental, not disconnect, but I'm just saying the underlying math in basketball maps really well, but there's still some variation. Last season, the Celtics were a 51-win team according to their point margin, but they won 55 games. So basically, it looked like they outperformed their expectation. This season, let's see, they are a 47-win team at the moment, which actually they're going to, barring some major fall apart, Brian.
Well, so that's their Pythagorean currently.
Their Pythagorean wins, they are a 47-27. They're a 47-win, 27-loss team right now. Their real record is 43-31. Barring some major fall apart in their last 10 games, they are going to finish as a stronger team this year than they were last year. This is reminiscent to me, by the way, of your Warriors. They won 73 wins. The next season, they didn't win as many wins, but they were on paper a stronger team, and oh boy, did it show in the playoffs. So that's kind of the point. They're underperforming their expected win-loss a little, and so people are freaking out. Last season, they overperformed their win-loss by just a little. Again, this is a 3 to 4 win range that we're talking about. And so I think you're saying it right? The media is grafting a narrative. Basically, if we break down the numbers, I'm willing to bet, Brian, if we look through this, the Celtics probably have 10 to 15 close games. You would expect that breakdown to be like 7-7, 7-8, right? 7 wins, 7 losses, close games. I'm willing to bet it breaks down to something like 5-12. And we've seen this before, and that can just be luck of the draw, right? The media, instead of just saying this is a pretty good team that's had some injuries and if they enter the playoffs healthy is fine, is going with it, they're falling apart. And the reason I think you're so level-headed on this is you see the overreaction to people on your Warriors all the time. In fact, we're in overreaction mode this week, Brian, because they got blown out and briefly lost that number 1 spot.
Yeah, they looked pretty good against the Pistons yesterday. But no, I mean, you're right. And I don't blame the reporters too much because, so here's the thing. It's like analysis versus reporting, basically, right? I see all this stuff on, social media. I'm like, oh, what's going on here? And I go and look at the numbers and I'm like, that's a little different from what I'm seeing, people reporting, right? So I make comments like that. But what are all the reporters doing? Well, they're going into the locker room or whatever, or texting the players, and they talk to one player, and they're like, wow, you guys lost. And the player is like, yeah, and there's all these toxic people in the locker room. I hate them all. And then they go and talk to 10 other players, and they all say that same thing. Yeah, we lost because we're all toxic. They're going to report, what the players say, right? It's just, I don't know. I think you can go a little bit farther than that, right? So, again, I don't want to get back into Washington, D.C. too much here, and I'm not talking about the Wizards. There's a really famous quote in reporting that's making the rounds, a lot these days about how the media's not doing a very good job on Washington, D.C. reporting. And it's something to the effect of if you go and interview one person and they tell you it's raining, and you go and interview another person and they tell you it's dry, there's no rain at all, you don't just print both of those quotes. You actually try to figure out if it rained or not. You actually try to get down to the truth. So anyway, I think that's all that's going on with Boston. But here's the last thing on it against me a little bit. I mean, maybe if there's some truth to that, if these players really all do hate each other, and again, I don't know, I've been following it that closely. Maybe that's overblown. That could lead to future problems. Like if you want to get to an extreme example, everyone's played in a pickup game of basketball before where a player will refuse to pass to them, right? You're not going to win that game. So I doubt that's what's happening to the Celtics. I think that's why the reporting is what it is.
I'm going to keep reiterating this point that we've brought up on last week's show, and I do have to do a post at some point, Brian, which is this is professional wrestling. As soon as you view all of modern day professional sports as professional wrestling, and there are a lot of professional wrestling fans that are basketball fans. It's a weird overlap. You understand what's going on. We're going to talk Mental Samurai and Chris Ye in a bit, and I thought it was amusing. Chris Ye has his own podcast, and he was talking to a Mental Samurai contestant, and he actually brought up TV tropes and said, "You're this TV trope on the show to this time." And it's like, as we were saying pre-show, Brian, these are real people, and the same is true in sports. You're real people. The media is trying to graft a narrative using the players in the NBA as a structure. So they're putting a narrative on top. And like I said, as soon as you see it as WWE, heels and faces, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. Here's who we're rooting for, here's who we're not. In sports, the underdog is almost always the good guy. So as soon as an underdog team becomes the champion, they become the villain. That's we're used to that. So as soon as you notice that happening, that's, it's very obvious. And so that's all we see all the time in basketball. And I think you very astutely notice it. You look at the numbers and say, this doesn't line up, but you go, oh, here's what they're doing. The story they are trying to sell is there is behind the scene drama with the Celtics, especially because another story we've got coming on is that Kyrie Irving, Kevin Durant are coming up on free agency. And that's a huge story that the media is going to have to deal with for months into the offseason. And so they're already laying the groundwork. If Kyrie Irving is feuding with his teammates and decides to switch factions again, very wrestling, right? You ditch your tag team partner. Oh my goodness, how could you betray them? That's all that's happening here. So I always appreciate that you notice that because it is very true.
Yeah, and the wrestling point is right. I mean, especially this is true for ESPN, right? They went through this embrace debate slogan that they tried to farm on all their shows. So big media, it's definitely true. They're really zeroing in on those tropes and those, faces and heels. So yeah, you're right.
All right, last one. Let's give some shout out to the most prolific commenter at the Boxscore Geeks, Jay Brett, who kind of razzed us. He agreed with us, but razzed us where he noticed we really like Ivica Zubac. Did I get that right?
I don't know how to pronounce his first name at all, but
Zubac's his last name.
Yeah.
The Lakers foolishly traded. Now, the point Jay Brett notes is that if we're breaking him down by rank, this is something Jay Brett does, which I really like. We'll say a player's above average, which is true, but he'll say, hey, if we rank this guy, he's the 40th most efficient center according to points over par in the NBA, that's fine. That's good. But that does mean he's essentially a backup center, and he is a backup center, right? He's coming off the bench. So we're talking about how much we love Zubac on the Clippers and, how it was a foolish move for the Lakers. So he kind of razzed us saying he doesn't know if moving Zubac moved the needle that much. And he's definitely right on that. And then also Iceman noted that he would love to see a healthy Clippers team. So I think that's true, too. The Clippers, Zubac isn't the huge needle mover, so it'll be really interesting to see how the Clippers do in the playoffs. I'm really psyched about the Western Conference playoffs, to be honest, Brian, because some of the Clippers, the Spurs, and the bottom of the West still look really strong. I think, and Arturo was putting us on Twitter as well, a first-round upset is very likely, and I would love to see that. That's definitely more fun than none.
Yeah, I agree, especially, that it's kind of been the theme of the show, health, coming into the playoffs. If they're, say Capella or Fareed aren't playing for the Rockets, they could be in trouble. They could miss a few threes. So, I mean, they're not, necessarily going to be a home team, but yeah, I think that's the most important point about the West versus the East is the top teams in the East are really good, maybe even better than the top West teams. But the West is just so loaded. Let's, 1 through 8, let's go back to this SRS here on Basketball Reference. So the West has the second-ranked Golden State, fourth-ranked Jazz, fifth-ranked Nuggets. They fell behind the Jazz recently, but are at a, close there. Portland is 6th. Rockets are 8th. Oklahoma City 9th. They've also fallen down a little bit. So almost all of the top 10, it's not 5 and 5 in the top 10 in SRS is what I'm trying to say. You get my point.
Yeah.
And Portland and the Spurs, they're both playing really well lately. I don't trust them necessarily, but they are good enough to do damage in the playoffs. They have some stars. So yeah.
I'm definitely rooting for both the Bucks and the Nuggets. One good piece of news for the Bucks could be, as you were noting, the East is a lot more top heavy, right? I think Milwaukee, Toronto, Philadelphia, really, really good. The rest not as good. Whereas out West, it's really, really more clumped. And I think there's a really good chance this could be true of the Warriors, right? Depending on where Utah settles, depending on where the Nuggets settles, Golden State might have to play multiple series at altitude that go to 6 or 7 games. Ooh. And this has happened before where if you beat up the Warriors before they go to the finals, that could be huge. So I think when we're talking health, the one advantage the Bucks could have is that the Bucks have a bunch of quick series out East. And the Warriors, for instance, or the Rockets or the Nuggets have a bunch of hard-fought altitude series out West. whoever comes out of the East might be, a little fresher than whoever comes out of the West. But we are speculating way too much on stuff that's still a ways out. Rest assured, come playoff time, we will have some fun speculation. I've got
I'll say one final thing on the Warriors. They're the narrative seems to be, are they a sure thing or not? Like are they a 99% chance of winning or 0 or something like that? And we've said in recent weeks, of course that's not true. It's all going to be much more tightly clumped than that. And here's what I always say is the blueprint for beating them in the playoffs. First, they have to just get unlucky shooting threes. Like that's the easiest way for a better team to lose, right? But then the bigger teams are the ones who do better against them in the playoffs. Like Oklahoma City back when they had Durant and the Warriors didn't, so that's kind of unfair. But they did this strategy very well. The Spurs have as well at times, although that's been a few years since they've faced them, and Kawhi was hurt that one time. But you see where I'm getting at. The big teams do well. So I'm afraid of Utah. I'm afraid of Oklahoma City, who's not been as good lately as a Warriors fan. If you're just going to put Gobert and Favors out there, or Adams and whoever else they have, Nerlens Noel, all these guys, like if you crush the boards and the Warriors get unlucky shooting, that's how you beat them. You have to crush them on the boards to start.
If the Nuggets do right, they have a good shot of that, because obviously
it's going to get should be in there for sure.
Lots of good. Mason Plumlee, for instance, is really good, so they have some good bigs. All right, actually, I have one more note on the Warriors. I've noticed this weird meta narrative that's been coming out, and it's a rerun time for me, Brian, where I just want to smack down a stupid myth I hear, and it brings me back to high school science biology, where it's just such bad. It's like no one pay attention to these simple science classes. So I'm seeing people say, "Oh my goodness, without Durant, the Warriors are this good. They're still a good team, but without Curry, they suck." And they're going, see, Curry is just so much more valuable than Durant. And that is a team construction issue. The Warriors have more forwards that they can play that are effective. They have, they've gone for it, right? They've got Iguodala, Klay Thompson, Draymond Green, another couple, Jordan Bell, another couple of names they've gone for. They are pretty stacked at that mid-tier to even, kind of tweener big position, power forward, small forward to center position. They're pretty good at that. And even pre-Durant, they were really, really stacked there. They're not as stacked at the guard position, in part, Andre Iguodala, they basically play him bigger, as I just noted. Some of their guards, Sean Livingston, are older, and some of their younger guards just are not as good as those other names I brought up. It bugs me when people use team construction as a criteria for grading how good a player is, because saying Curry is more valuable to the Warriors because Warriors have not gotten any decent backups for Curry is ridiculous, especially because, a lot of this is luck of the draw. The Warriors already have Draymond, Klay, Durant, Curry. That is an expensive core. So you're limited in how much you can spend on the other positions. You've actually given them credit. They've done a pretty good job moneyballing the big position, finding players.
But it's greedy, though.
Well, whatever. We'll leave it on the table. And I'm just saying, in terms of how they've spent their money, they have scrimped a little on backup point guards and basically said, we're going to roll the dice on on Curry's health. That is not indicative of who is a better player between Durant and Curry. I also get annoyed into the MVP discussion. They're both really good players. Both of these guys are really good. So when we start saying who's more important, who's better the team, the reality we've seen for so many good teams, especially, dynasty level teams, multiple titles, is you need multiple MVP caliber, multiple Hall of Fame players on your team. When you start getting into the pettiness, this is wrestling again, of which of your MVP caliber players is more important is where things kind of fall apart. So I'm more annoyed by the bad math going, that's not how you test that. We do not have a replacement level point guard, a replacement level shooting guard, a replacement level small forward, a replacement level power forward, a replacement level center for the 5 that we sub out for ours and see how well they do. Will they play the same level of competition at the same home away, same rest split? We don't have that. If we had that, we could do an experiment. If you had an intro science class in high school or college, you saw this. But then when we get to the NBA, people are like, I looked at these on-off stats and they say this. And I'm like, oh my God, this is the wrong way to do it. It's just one of those things that drives me nuts. Just a quick, this is going to be more of a shout out, Brian, but Jeremy Lamb had a half court. I think he threw it if you recall, there were a few years ago where there was a Hail Mary pass from Aaron Rodgers, threw the ball, I think, 3,000 feet in the air for a game-winning touchdown. I think Jeremy Lamb's heave went about as high as Aaron Rodgers' shot, Aaron Rodgers' pass. Jeremy Lamb, half-court game, more than half-court, he was behind the half-court line, half-court game winner to take down the Toronto Raptors and keep the Charlotte Hornets in playoff contention. Just a solid, good on you, wow, amazing play. Did not see that coming.
And I was really impressed by this shot because I can't remember seeing a three-pointer from that far out before that actually looked like a jump shot and not a heave. Like when he shot that, it looked like a jump shot. I was like, really? That's really nice form on that shot. I was very impressed by that play.
All right, let's get to this. I might be a slightly longer topic, but March Madness is going on. I have paid very little attention, Brian, except for the next subject we're going to talk. And all I want to give out is that there's a player. Tell me if I can you say his name? It's the really good one. He's on the script. I'll let you say it.
Jorah Mormont, Dre. He works for Daenerys Targaryen. No, I'm the only one who think that joke is funny, by the way.
Hilarious when you said it on Twitter, yeah.
Oh, thank you. I just had to say it somewhere, even if it's on Twitter. No, his real name is Ja Morant. And, yeah, he plays for, I want to say it's Murray State. I actually watched his games. And, yeah, he's really good.
Really good player. And all I noted when I started seeing all the hype about him, as I said, Dave Barry's research basically says the regular season NCAA data is a pretty good scouting tool. A player's college numbers basically explain 40% of the variation in their performance in the NBA. Now, still, that's a lot on the table. There's a lot to be said. There's a lot of room there for coaching, fit, etc. But that is a really good scouting tool, and it is better if we basically examine just picking a player based on their college numbers versus how teams actually pick. That is a better model. I'm not saying it's the best model. In fact, if Arturo and Past has done model, including like age, position, school, etc. Yeah. There are much better drafting models you can make, and possibly even going for fit or whatever. But I'm just saying players' college level numbers are really good. But when we actually analyze what teams do, a player's performance in the March Madness tournament really dictates how they grade things. And this absolutely drives me batty because players in all sports can just get hot for a little bit. You shouldn't necessarily be swayed by a couple of really hot games. Even the idea of a scout, right? The classic scout in sports is this person that decides they're going to watch a player for a game and they sit in the bench and watch a game. And if they play well that game, they're like, we'll recruit them. I don't even know how true that is, by the way, because that's I've learned that from movies. I'd love to talk to scouts to see how frequent or how much game film they break down. But that logic is just kind of out there. And I noted that, and another player I bashed this last week is D'Angelo Russell. Didn't put him on the script, but D'Angelo Russell just had an amazing 40-point game recently. And this season, I've seen a lot of people bashing Magic Johnson for trading him, including D'Angelo Russell. He said, it was so good, so good of me to get out of Los Angeles. And when you look at his numbers, he's a below-average scorer. The way I broke this down, I tweeted about this week. There have been 40 seasons, which is remarkable. So in 1980, the three-point line was introduced. There have been 40 years with the three-point line in the NBA. In 30 of those seasons, D'Angelo Russell's true shooting efficiency is below league average. And basketball is really the only sport where you can be below average in efficiency and people think you're good. In baseball, if your earned run average is really high, no one thinks you're good, or your batting average is really low, no one thinks you're good. Football, if your passing rate is really bad, no one thinks you're really good. Hockey, it's interesting because basically getting a shot that actually hits the net is the impressive part. So, efficiency is not as important there, but you can't have someone with not a lot of goals and say they're a good player, but you can in basketball. And all I noticed just, these overreacting to one game. I said, if you're going to overreact to D'Angelo Russell having this one amazing 40-point game and chastise Magic Johnson for it, where were you when he went 6 for 23 against the Atlanta Hawks, one of the worst teams in the league, and they only won by 2 when I think the Vegas line was probably 12-15. So that always bugs me when it's like, if you just praise the good games and ignore the bad games, or more importantly, ignore the aggregate, that's where you get fooled. And on the script, I actually put this as the interview fallacy. So I don't know if you've had this, Brian. I'm very pessimistic about interviews. There's a great Dan Ariely podcast I'm going to have to try and find and write about at some point. But on this, Dan Ariely talks to somebody that has these people go for interviews, and it's staged, of course.
You're saying a job interview.
It's a staged job interview. So
Okay.
it is an experiment. It's done in a collegiate level, but basically he has people that interview other people and grade how good they're doing for the job. And they're trying to ascertain how the graders decide who's good for a job. Here's the trick. They ask them a series of multiple choice questions. So I have you come in for the interview and I say, Brian, I'm going to ask you, a question. How do you approach your work? Get in early, get in late, but go hard, stay up all night, something like that.
Yeah.
A set of 4 questions. The reason they do multiple choice is there are 2 groups. One group answers honestly, the other group answers at random. They have an algorithm in their head, so they just know So it's something based on like how the interview phrases the question. They use the letters of the thing to decide which of the options they're going to use. So they can very quickly decide it, but it's like a random number generator, and they just randomly answer this interview, and they have them grade who's good. And what they found is, people had made up their mind ahead of times. They had looked at their resume and decided how good, and the interview didn't matter. And there are lots of things. We were talking a little last week, Brian, how, I'm interview trained at Google, or was as recently as 6 years ago. And even going through that process, I was like, I don't know if this is the best way to hire people. And even some of the numbers would bear this out. Google for years used people's SAT scores as a criteria. And then they analyzed and said, hey, SAT scores don't matter at all for how people are successful at Google. Google for years thought it mattered that they did 8 interviews for every candidate.
That's expensive.
Yeah, that is expensive. And then they also found out that the last 4 interviews didn't really add anything. So it's like there are people that are utterly confident in this interview and how strong their interview is for deciding someone. But when you break it down with them, you can go, interviewing as a whole is a very flawed system, and we're not sure it works right. And I've had this discussion with lots of people, and lots of people agree, which is great. And what I always end up with is, at the very end of the conversation, they kind of look at me and they go, but I have this one really good trick I like using in an interview that tells me, and I just want to shout. Like one person was like, one I've heard is, you take them out to lunch and see how well they tip. Well, it's possible that if you dressed up for an interview, this would be a really common thing. Let's say I dress up for an interview, I wear my dress clothes, and I realize, holy cow, my dress clothes don't have the baggy pockets my jeans do. My wallet looks absolutely gigantic. I'm just going to bring my ID. I'm just going to bring my ID and a credit card that doesn't have a high limit to the job interview, just, because I don't want this big bulge in my pocket to look bad. I end up at the interview, the guy takes me out to lunch and then expects me to tip, and I don't have money to tip with or whatever, right? That might happen. There are all sorts of scenarios that can explain why your little trick doesn't work. But I've seen so many people convinced that these little tricks explain it. And so I saw the same thing when I bashed D'Angelo, not bashed, but when I just said, hey, look, one good game doesn't mean D'Angelo Russell's a good player. And he's not a good player yet. He might become a good player. He's still young. That's the promising part. But he's not good yet. John Morant might, and like I said, I am so behind on NCAA numbers, Brian, so I don't even know who's good or who's bad. John Morant might be a good baller, but just because he's played well in 1 or 2 March Madness games does not mean he's a good draft pick. And as soon as I tweeted these out, people would say, well, the thing is he's at a small school, so we need to see how he's going to perform in this large stage to know. Or with D'Angelo Russell, well, you see his ceiling explains how well he's going to do. And I believe the person's name is Karl Rove. I hope I'm getting that right. But Karl Rove responded to me by noting the funny thing about D'Angelo Russell, when someone says, how many players can go for 27 points in a quarter? He's like, well, that actually tells you if this person is confident enough to take 15 shots in a quarter, even if their efficiency is below average, which is a completely other answer, which most people aren't looking for. So when I say the interview fallacy, that's it. When you have these players that have 1 or 2 good games and everyone's like, oh my goodness, they're amazing, you can just say, that's not how you should judge players. And that was all I was going for.
Yeah, I mean, this is very similar to what we were talking about last week, right? With the hot hand, the Todd Whitehead article about it, and then the Rondo ratio, right? Where the inconsistent players seem to get a little more credit because people remember those good games, right? And it's funny because here's what. Okay, so again, what you said is right. Neither of us have ever been inside of an NBA front office, so we don't really know how decisions are being made, really. So I'm just basing this off of what I hear, ex-coaches and analysts talking about on TV, right? Because I have watched, thousands of games on TV over the years. So what it seems to me, here's how they get around this, Dre, is they see it as a good thing because the player is rising to the occasion, right? And you were kind of getting at this. Like, regular season doesn't matter because there's nothing on the line. All I care about is performance when the game is on the line, right? So I care about these playoff or tournament numbers. I don't care about regular season numbers at all. Because it's a judge of character, basically, right? If you have good character, you're going to play well when everything's on the line. We know that thinking is not true. We know that if you're a scout is what we're talking about, right? What do you really want to achieve? You want to know how will this player play in the future, not how they played in the past necessarily or the present, however number of games. What's the best indicator of how well they're going to play in the future? It's not that playoff game. It's the regular season, right? It's a bigger set of data. We know the bigger set of data is always going to be more reliable in situations like this. So people are just looking for different things is what I think.
Well, what I've also found is frustrating with data is that people will sometimes want the data to be more meaningful than it is. And that's always the rough part when you just say, listen, I understand that you want to know more about a player's clutch performance or how they'll perform in the playoffs. We just don't have the sample size for it. Now, I'm going to actually try and see if I can organically weave this to our next topic, Brian. You were saying how this player reacts on the biggest stage. The other problem with that logic is there are lots of things out of their control. For instance, one of the most prolific images, it's NBA, not NCAA. Prolific images is the Michael Jordan shoulder shrug. I believe this was against Portland. Michael Jordan just is shooting lights out, and it's absolutely absurd. And people watching it don't know what they're seeing because even for Michael Jordan, his shooting efficiency. And at some point, he just turns and he shrugs. He's like, "Yeah, I don't know what's going on either. This is an absurd game." You could have had a good Portland Trailblazer in that game that's playing well, and they get blown out, and it's like, well, Michael Jordan went off, or maybe you had a bad mismatch, something like that. Or maybe you had a bullshit coach. So I'm going to try and get the details right. I haven't even looked this up. What I saw is our good friend, Coach Nick. I don't want to say good friend. Sorry, Coach. Awesome follow, who I've met in person, who's been very nice to me. Coach Nick, bballbreakdown on Twitter, said he is looking forward to the day when this type of coaching just goes extinct. Because there's an older era of coaching, the Bobby Knight generation, that thinks berating players, yelling at players, crack the whip kind of coaches. And by the way, the uncomfortable imagery you get there still very much applies to college sports.
Yep.
And so so the Spartans, it occurs to me how little I know, but basically he got really upset with one of his players, started yelling at him, shoved him in the chest. I don't know if he slapped him in the face. The players had to get between him. He was yelling, and it is just so fucking frustrating to watch coaches treat players like this and think it's okay. And we've talked forever on this show about how in so many other industries and areas, this would not be acceptable behavior, even from a manager. And so it's so weird that we see this area, this sports area, particularly college and high school sports, where people just accept that the coach is supposed to be a hard ass and a jerk to the players, and people even defend it. And we are just so vehemently against it. It's why we love, like, the big names I've brought up: Coach Nick, B-Ball Breakdown on Twitter; Travis Heath, also a basketball coach on Twitter, who's worked with the Nuggets and the Minnesota Timberwolves; Art Rondo, we bring up all the time, who worked with the Knicks. I've seen all of them say, and you were saying this to me pre-show, Brian, when you're trying to adjust the mental zone, to adjust the attitude, to adjust the performance of a player, there are so many better ways. And this old school mentality isn't just like mean and cruel, it's ineffective. So it's so frustrating to see people defend it so vehemently when, from a moralistic standpoint, it should already be off the table. I've got a brief tangent on that. So as a weird example, Steve Jobs gets a big pass. I found there's a big blind side to what a jerk he was. If you look up, if you learn about Steve Jobs, the way he treated his employees, his coworkers, even his family, he was a monumental dick.
Yeah, he tried to legally fight his daughter to say he wasn't really her dad or something like that. It was sad.
And just how he treated fellow coworkers, etc. Now, first off, from a weird perspective, I don't necessarily think his success had to do with that. I think a lot of times people, when they see success, will say, what did this person do and graft it on? And when we look at Apple, right place, right time, good team, etc., I don't necessarily think with or without Steve Jobs being a dick that would or would not have happened. But you could make the argument Steve Jobs acted this way and as a result made billions of dollars for a company. And if you want to maybe believe this, I'm not saying I do, but you could maybe say he advanced technology and human experience, right? You could maybe make that argument. So there might be some positive outcome to capitalism, if that's where you want to go to society, if that's what you want to go to Steve Jobs behaving this way. And I'm not even saying I believe that, but I'm saying I'm giving you that as a very, 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 very low bar of defense that I still don't think I'm okay with, to be honest. When you look at college coaches, it's basketball. It's a basketball game. Someone's going to win the tournament. It doesn't matter who. Someone's going to win the tournament. Why are people defending treating other humans this way when the outcome is a basketball game? It is not advancing society. Well, it is arguably making that school money. It doesn't go to the students. It doesn't go to the players. It is so bizarre to see people say it is acceptable to behave this way over a sport.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I guess I'm reading a lot about politics lately and less about sports, but this goes to our overall conversation right now, right? Like, this is democracy versus authoritarianism, you know? Are we in a liberal society where we care about, people being equal and fairness and treating each other well and all that, which is what we say democracy should be? Or is it about, knowing your place in society, knowing your role, and being subservient to that person, who's above you in the hierarchy? And I think that's the mindset here. You have to submit to the coach. And, I don't know. I always think about it in terms of, I have this like competitive gaming mindset where, if you want to look at like Madden or something like that, it's like, well, maybe, let's say Steve Jobs, you're just talking about as a Madden player, why is he such a good player in the, 80s tech CEO game or whatever game he would be a player in, right? Well, he's really hardworking. He's really smart. He has this crazy design aesthetic and understands where design is going. That's maybe his biggest asset, all these different things. And maybe we'll say, okay, he was like a 90 out of 100 rating overall, right? Well, if he had been less of an asshole and actually, helped his employees, maybe he'd be a 95 instead of a 90, So he succeeded in spite of that is what I'm saying. And that's Coach Nick's point too, that if Izzo had been nicer to his players, maybe they would have played better, So yeah, it's misattributing. It's old school mindset, misattributing success. Like you said, the science says that you should be more of a positive coach. That's
the last part that bugs me is that we could get into a very moralistic debate, and Steve Jobs is an example of it. And
I'm deliberately avoiding that moral side.
But I'm going to approach it head on because I'm going to say,
good.
Even from like a Hollywood aesthetic, there are so many entertainers, right? Finding Neverland is coming out, this movie about Michael Jackson, and is putting a lot of people's dissonance front and center, where it's saying this is one of the most amazing musical performers ever, who is also a horrible human being. How do you reconcile that, right? This person created a lot of our popular culture while also doing horrible things that we have to, and how to deal with that as a society, because so many things that we enjoy and appreciate have dark underbellies to them, and dealing with that is part of humanity, and it's a very, very hard problem. But that's the point. It's a problem where you're going, this good thing with this bad part, how do I reconcile if it's a net positive for me or society or whatever, which is a hard problem in their entire studies of philosophy, et cetera, about that. When we end up in this category of this doesn't even generate what you're wanting it to, this badness isn't even doing what you think it does. So we don't even have to get onto the moralistic stage of is this acceptable? We can say if this person's job is to be a coach and we want them to win games, they're doing it wrong. So that's what makes it.
You know what pisses me off, Dre, just as a quick tangent before you keep going? Like coaches or players that get technicals by yelling at the ref. People are like, oh, this is going to fire up the team and all that. It's like, you gave up free points to them that you didn't need to, outside of the game.
Yeah, that's definitely, yeah. That's the technical is a perfect example, because I've seen the technical. I've seen like this bit of logic. I think Phil Jackson has said it though, and maybe I'll agree, where a coach will get a technical, and their logic is, I need to, the game is being reffed incorrectly, so I'm going to bite the bullet. I'm going to get in trouble so that the ref knows that they're reffing incorrectly, but I don't want one of my players to get penalized. And I've heard Phil Jackson use that logic too, where he'd go in press media and insult the referees and get a fine. And the key was he wanted to signal to his players, I'm fighting on your behalf. So maybe that's
I can see some fairness to that.
But you're saying when a player just gets upset and does something stupid and people are like, well, they were really in the game. It's like, no, there's no benefit to this. They did something stupid and it hurt their team. So this Izzo point, there's not a benefit to this. The people that are defending him saying kids these days are too soft. It's like, ask yourself why you're upset with soft. Because if you're saying soft means they are bad at basketball, the data is just against you. And I'm sorry. And so if you're going to try and defend this, people need to be able to handle someone yelling at this. If you can't even tell me this benefits them in making them better at putting a ball through a hoop, which, like I said, I don't think the trade-off's worth it. If someone's like, he's going to be better at putting a ball through a hoop, I'm like, that's so what? No. I'm like, at least give me an iPhone. I need a free iPhone before I'm even going to consider that yelling worth it. It doesn't even work there. So
and even Phil Jackson's logic, and I said, maybe I can see some of the logic there. It's better to have your coach thrown out of the game than your star player. Well, what if just no one gets thrown out of the game? That's better for everyone. I don't know. Like, I just don't think you should have to yell at someone to play with high energy. That's all.
I'm going to give one more shout out. We always bring him up. One of our favorites, Kevin Draper. And I think this is an important person to shine a light on. Greg Popovich, he's a darling to us, right? We think he is, one of the best NBA coaches. The numbers bear that out. He's a jerk. He's a jerk to the media. He's one thing I heard. So this is I won't say who, but I heard from like a rumor mill that basically when he had Tim Duncan was okay being yelled at by Greg Popovich, the same college coach mentality. And so essentially Tim Duncan would say, I'll let Greg Popovich yell at me to send a message to other players when the team's not doing well. Tim Duncan retires. Greg Popovich starts yelling at Kawhi, and Kawhi's like, fuck this. So what you're saying, that was a net negative for the Spurs. No matter how well they're doing now, first off, they would be better off with Kawhi than without, and they almost had Kawhi than without, and they lost a couple of seasons where Kawhi could have been playing for them. So we're trying to argue, like the same person where we kind of ignore bad behavior because of success. Like Greg Popovich actually falls in that category where he has treated lots of people very poorly, and I think does get a free pass on it because he's a really successful NBA coach. And I'll give a shout out to Kevin Draper, who's one of the few people I've known for years who's just like, there's no need for him to treat a reporter who that's their job, right? That's the reporter's job. The reporter's job, their job sends them there. The NBA wants them there. You probably have a contract between the NBA and that organization in some sort with ad revenue. They are supposed to ask you a question. Basketball is a really effing simple game. There are only so many questions you can ask. It's not like I can go and be like, well, I noticed that Manu Ginobili was shooting 2 degrees higher and a slight tilt to the left. Is that because of the new hoops you installed? No, that's not the question. You're going to be like, you were down by 10 at the half. What did you do to adjust? Like, there's only so many questions. Greg Popovich acting like a dick about that is actually unacceptable. And it is kind of, my mind's changed. I think I'll even throw shade at myself. I've definitely given him more of a pass in the past and even been like, oh, haha, that's so funny. When you see the interviews and you're like, no, that's just bullshit.
Yeah. And I'll throw shade at myself too. So first of all, I have not felt that way. I've always been with Kevin Draper and always hated Popovich, how he treats the players and media. But I have not pointed that out enough on the show here and just, kept saying how great of a coach he is. So yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. He is a jerk and he would be a much better coach if he wasn't.
Oh, we don't know, but I'm just saying it's.
I've seen enough. Like I've seen him on TV again for, hundreds of hours. Like, I've seen enough. He needs to tone it down. But he won't, right? He's in his 70s now. Yeah. It's just the way it is. But, I wonder if because so he does seem like a very thoughtful person outside of the game. I wonder if he maybe doesn't even like the way he acts in games. I'm not sure, but he should stop.
Yeah. Well, we'll see if he ever does. All right. I called this segment Mental Samurai Dre Has a Problem. So good friend of the show, Chris Ye, is going to be a contestant on the show Mental Samurai, which is a brand new kind of a Who Wants to Be a Millionaire vein show airing on Fox, hosted by Rob Lowe. Premise is you strap a contestant into like a gyroscope, moves really fast. They have 4 categories of questions. They have 5 minutes to answer 12 of them. There's a brief bit of lag where they're being whipped around in this gyroscope in between each. You're not allowed to miss one. And it premiered last week. And so here's why I'm saying I have a problem. So Chris is going to be on it. We're like, well, we want to root Chris along, and we're a big fan of his. Chris has his own podcast. I'll give a little feedback. So there is a great episode in terms of content. Chris recorded an episode about the first episode of Mental Samurai where he actually interviewed 3 of the contestants, which is great. Admittedly, I think Chris is still learning the podcasting ropes. So whatever software he used to edit, it's kind of a rough one, and I bugged Chris about it. So I'm hoping they improve, because I think he's reaching out to more contestants. I think Chris might be doing more interviews with more contestants on the show as it goes on. And he did manage to interview Clayton Anderson, a retired astronaut, Joey Gutman, who is a 29-year-old. Oh man, I spelled his name wrong in the article. I have to change that. 29-year-old attorney. And then Sam Durbin, who is a trucking sales executive / drag queen who actually did really well on the show. He managed to interview them all, and so there's behind the scene. So I started watching the show for Chris. I was like, I want to see what's going on. So when Chris's episode comes on, which is a month out, and I started watching it, Boxscore Geek Brain went off. I was about 10 minutes into the episode, and I was like, I'm going to start tracking stats for this, because, I just want to do that. And I know it's new enough of a show that no one else is doing it. So I went through and recorded all of the trivia question types, how long it took each contestant to get through, kind of tracked how, did some meta-analysis of saying, here's how long it would take, the rate you would have to answer questions if you wanted to succeed, because you have to answer 12 questions perfectly in 5 minutes. There's some travel time in between each question. So that means you essentially get about 16 seconds a question if you want to answer in time. And went through and tracked that all and did kind of advanced, I'll put in quote, advanced stats for the first episode with some commentary. And so that was a lot of fun. And then, of course, like I said, listen to Chris's podcast about it. So in terms of reality TV, as I'll put it this way, it's nothing special, but it doesn't need to be, because I'm just a huge reality TV show buff. And in the realm of trivia show with excitement games, I really enjoyed this. Having a sense of urgency through trivia shows is fun. This is more enjoyable to me than Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And Sam Durbin is an absolute blast. That they did it well. Reality TV show, no matter how true it is, Brian, it's still spliced, right? They still pick the most compelling narratives. They still edit it together so the story looks compelling. I was seeing behind the scenes, where there are failed interview attempts, not interview attempts, they ask the same question 3 times, they use the best take, all of that. Regardless, I still really enjoy shows that have stats, shows with trivia, reality TV. So this ticked all of those boxes. I'm hoping I can keep up with it as the season goes on, at least through Chris's episode. And like I said, I recorded all the stats for the first episode. Noticed that Sam Durbin just nailed it. Absolutely. Made some notes about meta commentary, the strategy you'd want to use on the show. And then, of course, the difference between this show and even say Who Wants to Be a Millionaire or Jeopardy is, since it's a new show, a lot of these people going in, and Chris right before the segment, Brian on Twitter actually said, there was not really any prep time. The people doing this episode didn't really get a chance to learn the game ahead of time. So there are a few puzzles where there's a very obvious trick in future I would use. For instance, one of them is memory, right? They show 6 images, 2 rows of 3, and then show it to you for about 5 seconds and then say, where was the owl? Where was the cat? Which is one of the images. I would say the very wise thing to do is just very quickly say in order, just 1 to 6, right? Owl, cat, bed, dog, whatever, right? Just do that over and over and over, and then it's really easy to answer it. No one really knew how that game works. That flubbed some people up. So if you're a fan of Mental Samurai and wanted to know how long stuff took and what I thought, I've got that up at nerdnumbers.com. And then, I've tweeted out to some of the people on the show because they're on Twitter, including Chris. So that's up there. It's more information than you need. And like I said, I'm well aware that my brain is broken where my love of reality TV show plus my love of stats, I started watching this. Was like, yep, got to start keeping stats on it.
Yeah, I'm reading this article you wrote, and it's really interesting. This does look like a complicated show. So just to add to what you're saying here, there's like 4 different categories of things they do: knowledge, puzzles, sequence, and memory. And then there's, 2, 4, 6, 7, like 5 to 8 different things in each of those categories. So yeah, there's a lot of different mini games. It's more like Mario Party than anything.
This was episode 1. This was episode 1, so we clearly haven't even seen them all. But
wow.
To see some of them repeat. So it's not the same set of questions to each contestant. It's not the same order. It's not the same mini games. It's just basically you have 12 questions. 3 in one of 4 categories, like you said: knowledge, puzzles, sequence, memory, and then you're just basically trying to answer them as quick as you can. And so I thought it was a very effective way of doing a high-paced trivia one. One of the category, the 2 last people that were up, Becky Eldridge, who's a 46-year-old writer, and Sam Durbin, both amazing. And actually what ended up happening is while I was recording Becky Eldridge, I noticed when I was like transcribing my notes for this post, I was like, oh, I forgot to record this because this part got exciting enough, right? Because it is actually pretty high paced. So, like I said, we're going to keep up on this, especially. We'll see if we talk to Chris more about it because he's got some insight. I know he's been doing some viewing parties. I will say the following. Clayton Anderson, who's a 59-year-old retired astronaut, was also on Chris Ye's podcast about this. He's also written a child's book. He was just completely screwed. And I got to give mad props to Chris. Because Chris used a TV trope when he was talking to him. He said, "You're the sacrificial lion." TV tropes is using a lot of narrative devices that show up routinely in movies, TV, and literature. The sacrificial lion is if you want to show that a villain is really bad, you bring up a character that's a badass, and you just have them get destroyed really quick to say, "Oh my goodness!" Right?
Like Apollo Creed was the villain in the first few Rockies. They bring in Drago and they literally kill off Apollo Creed as a character to build up the heel heat for Drago.
And then if you compound it, it's called the Worf effect, because that was the funny thing. On Star Trek: The Next Generation, Worf is this, I almost said Romulan. Apologies, Worf. You're not Romulan. Klingon warrior. He's this Klingon warrior who's supposed to be a badass.
Yeah, he's got slightly different face ridge makeup, so he's a Romulan instead of a Klingon.
No, Klingon, not a Romulan.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Romulan's related to Vulcans. We'll leave. You're ruining our geek cred, Brian. But anyway, he's supposed to be this badass Klingon security officer. But to show that the villain is dangerous, basically you just get Worf beat up. It's the same thing with the X-Men. And so it's called the Worf effect, where you have the same badass character just get beat up over and over and over again to show off the villain, to the point where you're like, this guy never wins, and he always gets beat up in fights. And so I was saying, if Clayton Anderson, this is very rote for reality TV shows. This show fills a lot of narrative themes and methods. If you're a fan of reality TV, this will be very familiar to you. Redemption episodes are a common one. Clayton Anderson is a prime candidate to be a redemptive arc. And so if he comes back and misses on the first question again, he'll definitely be the Worf. We'll have to call him the Worf if that happens. And all I'll say, though, is watching this episode, some of these questions are easy. It's like a toss-up. It's like Smokey the Bear prevents what? And the 2 questions are like teenage smoking and forest fires. Duh. Everybody's going to get that. Clayton Anderson had 4 images of clocks spinning where one of the hour hands was slightly off, and was asked to list which one was different. And I don't even know if they were all at the same orientation. Hardest question by far on the thing. He got it first and just went down. And I was like, wow, that was just rough. That was a tough question.
Yeah, it's an interesting looking show. You're hyping me up. I definitely want to go see it now. I did not watch that first episode. I'm going to watch Chris's for sure, I think. But yeah, it's funny. You were talking about Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, right? That is kind of like fake tension, because they give them as much time as they want, but they're playing the dramatic music, and you're like, come on. But then if it's 5 minutes and they're spinning in a chair, that's real, physical drama. I don't know.
It was done really well. I actually made that comment in it where I said I could tell from watching that this gyroscope is really whipping him around. It doesn't play as well on TV as I think, and because this is early, right? This show is early, and as shows go along, you work out things that work. And so if it does get renewed for a second season, et cetera, you can find things. And then, of course, you'll get stronger competitors who realize, oh, here's the strategy. Here's what I should do. I don't know if this was in the rules or not. I should ask Chris about this. I don't know if you had to wait till the question was done, a la Jeopardy. In Jeopardy, the buzzers don't go off, aren't activated until he's finished saying the question. So you can't buzz in.
Yeah, I've heard Jeopardy champions say figuring out the earliest you're allowed to buzz in is one of the most key things for that game.
I didn't see on this episode people answer some of the questions early, where it seemed like since there's a big card in front of them they could read, like if you read fast enough, if you could say boom immediately, they do have like a little lock switch. They have to say lock it in and lock it in when it happens. I don't know if like that's not activated until the question's done or until Rob Lowe says okay, et cetera. So there's all sorts of stuff like that as it goes along. But, at least for a pilot episode, they did really well. And I was telling you this pre-show, Brian, one thing I like about reality TV when we talk things like diversity and stuff, the cast of characters on this first episode is freaking amazing. Just a wide variety of stories. As mentioned, so if you don't know, we've got a Stanford dropout graphic designer, a retired astronaut, a former Major League Baseball pitcher, he pitched for the Brewers, a 29-year-old attorney who's also played in other reality TV, other game shows, Jeopardy and Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, a 46-year-old writer, and then a trucking sales executive and drag queen. Goes by the name Brianna Banana. So they're supposed to rhyme. So it's just, and Sam Durbin makes this show. They did really well having him be the final act on the show. That was very enticing, exciting. He was, despite the fact that he's getting whipped around in a gyroscope, he's got a great attitude, all sorts of funny lines. So if you don't want to watch the full hour or 46 minutes, whatever it is with commercials, right? Just watching the very last segment is definitely worth it.
I don't know the answer to this question about Cardi B's shoes, by the way, that he looks very stumped by in the photo you posted on your blog.
I actually, I was going to, so that one was amazing because in my notes, I actually said he got it based on style. A lot of the contestants talk their answers aloud as they're thinking it. And he goes,
so he didn't know, but he worked through it. I love that.
In the song, she references the shoe color in the bottom, and he says, based on that color in that bottom, it has to be this one. And I was like, oh wow, like I was wicked impressed that he got that.
That's funny.
All right, well, we have gone the classic hour and a half, super long show, Brian. I'll let you get any cappers you want to say, and then I'll let us out.
No, just real fast on the positive coaching. There is the Positive Coaching Alliance. I don't know a ton about them. I know Coach Nick is actually involved with them, though. So he doesn't just, talk about it. I think he actually does, actively, positively coaches. So good job on him. And I hope it's a good organization. They're celebrating 20 years.
Awesome. All right. Well, we have been the Boxscore Geek Show. If you find us not through the website, you can find us at boxscoregeeks.com. We go live every Monday, usually around 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, twitch.tv/Nerd Numbers. We're also on iTunes and Stitcher, the Boxscore Geek Show. Subscribe, upvote, helps us out. If you miss the live show, you can catch recaps, channel Nerd Numbers on YouTube. I've been your host, Ray Alvarez, a.k.a. Nerd Numbers, co-host Brian Foster, Boxscore Brian on Twitter. Hope your team is in the playoffs, because if they're not making it.